Many of you know me, and I know many of you, but for those who don't, my name is Alan Price. I am the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's forum, both in person and online. To open, I humbly begin with a land acknowledgement to recognize that the land on which we stand and sit was once stewarded by Indigenous peoples. And this is an institution that preserves history, makes history accessible, and challenges all Americans to engage in the civic opportunity and struggle of helping the nation grow ever closer to the noblest ideals of its founding. And in accordance with that mission, I invite all of us to learn more about and learn more from our nation's history, including Indigenous history, and contemplate how to honor and steward the land that each of us inhabits. This evening's program is presented as part of the Kennedy Library Forum series, and I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters for the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, as well as the Mass Cultural Council. We thank all of you for silencing any electronic devices that like to make noises. And we look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. If you are joining us online, you'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on the YouTube page during the program. And when Q&A begins, we will invite those of you who are here in person to proceed to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. And please actually make them questions. It works so much better. Michael Auslin has kindly agreed to sign copies of his book following tonight's program. Our bookstore has copies available for sale if you are interested. As America's 250th anniversary approaches, we are thrilled to have this opportunity to explore the remarkable story of the Declaration of Independence with our distinguished guests. I'm so glad to welcome Michael Auslin to the Kennedy Library this evening. He is the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Prior to that, he was an associate professor of history at Yale. He wrote his new book, National Treasure: How the Declaration of Independence Made America, as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress's John W. Kluge Center and an American Heritage Partners Fellow at the Society of the Cincinnati's American Revolution Institute. He writes a Substack, The Potomac Packet, on Washington, D.C., past and present. I'm also delighted to welcome Arun Rath, our moderator for this evening. He has worked and produced for a variety of programs for GBH for more than 20 years, in a career that has spanned public, radio, and television, and national work for NPR and PBS. Roth currently hosts the local broadcast of GBH's All Things Considered, and was named Best Radio Personality in Boston for his work hosting In It Together, a radio show and podcast that broadcast nightly during the height of the pandemic. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you. Thank you. I am so delighted to be here. I love this book.
Thank you.
It was just a delight to read, just in every aspect. One of the things that's so fascinating, makes this such a page turner, is that it's both a physical history of this document, going down to the printing, the distribution, how it physically came together, but also I would call it kind of a metaphysical history as well. The ideas and concepts that went into its creation and its continuing and evolving life in the world of ideas, and the world of ideas of our nation. So in this conversation, I'd like to toggle back and forth between the physics and the metaphysics of it all, and start with the metaphysics, because it was a concept first, and talk about the ideas that were percolating at the time when Jefferson put pen to paper, because this was not, the Declaration was not full of original ideas, but from reading your book, I understand that was very much, it was intended not to be an original document in that way.
Right, Arun. First, thank you for joining me here. Alan and Liz and the team at the JFK Library. It's such an honor to be here to launch the book here. I worked a lot with National Archives, and so to come to a NARA facility and NARA group, but of course also the cradle of the revolution, right? If you're going to write a book on the Declaration and its impact on American history, where else do you want to launch it but in Boston? So it's a great honor to be here, and thank you to all of you for coming this evening to join me to talk about this. One word that I never thought about while writing the book was metaphysics. But that says more about me than it does about the question. But you're right in that sense. What I found most interesting was actually the idea of the Declaration was almost not at all what we think of today, in the sense and why I wanted to write the book, that this to me was a treasure and it was an icon and it was a guiding light, or as I really think it's a beautiful way of putting it, as President Ford put it 50 years ago at the bicentennial. He called it the Polaris of our political system. It's unchanging. To Jefferson and the Committee of Five that foisted upon him the job of writing the Declaration, this was an administrative task that had to be done. The really important thing had happened 2 days before, on July 2nd, which is when the Continental Congress voted for independence. Now, nobody outside of the Continental Congress really knew that had happened, and hence you needed to tell these Americans who were losing the war at that point in time, in the summer of '76, they were losing the war. You needed to tell them that they were part of a new country, whatever that meant. No one had made a country. Countries were or were not, but no one had made one. So you had to tell them they were part of a new country. You had, as John Adams much later in life said, maybe only a third of British Americans supported independence. A third were opposed, and in good American fashion, a third had no opinion whatsoever, right? So you had to now try to get them on board, get them on side. You needed to tell them what was happening. And very critically and crucially, you had to tell the world, because without the support, particularly France and Spain, we were going to lose this war. We needed material support. So the Declaration, it wasn't an afterthought, but they were doing lots of other things. And there were other committees that were trying to come up with model treaties and come up with Articles of Confederation. And so when Jefferson sits down in June, probably did it over about 10 days in June of 1776, Congress goes on recess because they want to get unanimity in the vote. They know John Adams, who's the real force behind this. Again, John Adams, happy to talk about him here in Boston. John Adams, the Atlas of Independence. He knows, and they know, that they're going to get a majority vote, but they need a unanimous vote of the 13 colonies. And so they go on a recess for 3 weeks, and in that period to prepare, they task the Committee of Five, which John Adams is on, along with Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and they give the pen to Jefferson. So he has to come up with this statement. Now, he had been thinking about things like this because he had started drafting a constitution for Virginia, which had what are the charges in the middle that nobody reads today. He had started with those. So he puts those in. He had read George Mason's Virginia Bill of Rights, which had just come out, and he reworks some of it and puts that in the beginning. All men are created equal with life, liberty, and property / pursuit of happiness. He comes up with a few references to God, not as many as Congress ultimately puts in. But as you indicate, he very clearly later expresses, we don't know exactly what he thought at the time, he didn't want to say anything new. If you said something new, you could have thrown a wrench into the whole plans. People would have started debating what was new. Rather, what he tried to do, as he put it later, was make it an expression of the American mind. That these were things that colonists had been arguing for a decade. Comes from things like the Boston 1772 pamphlet here, which expresses, again, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness / property, and inalienable rights. It comes from his own writings on the rights of British North America. It obviously is coming from Enlightenment thought. It's John Locke, which itself is interpreting biblical concepts of natural right. These were things that Americans had been debating for a long time. And Pauline Maier, in her wonderful 1997 book, American Scripture, finds about 90 American declarations of independence of one sort or another in the lead up to July. So the metaphysics are something that they were not abstract. They were, in fact, the very things that Americans had been debating and talking about. And now that they were in the war and losing that war, they became operative, so to speak. And that, I think, is where that bridge comes from the experience, really, again, from here in Boston, from the Intolerable Acts, the Tea Party, the responses, the shutting down of the colony to 1776.
It was wild. It hit me when I was reading this that Thomas Jefferson, at this time, is unlike the other bigger figures, Benjamin Franklin, the Adamses. He's not yet Thomas Jefferson, really. And the way he gets assigned this is basically, well, he's got time to, and Jefferson likes to write.
Yeah, very much. I mean, it was rumored that he'd never spoken in Congress. He had come there. The truth is, he didn't want to be in Congress. He wanted to be back home in Williamsburg, and he wanted to be writing a constitution for Virginia. That's what he really wanted to do. He missed two constitutions. He missed the Virginia Constitution, which back then, don't forget, everyone knew that these were going to be 13 sovereign states in some sort of umbrella. So what really was important was not a federal government that no one had any real concept of. It was going to be the states with their constitutions running their societies. He wanted to be there. And then, of course, the second constitution he missed was the US Constitution because he was in France. So he was disappointed in not being able to be a constitution writer. But of course, by the end of his life, one of the three things he asked to be put on his tombstone is author of the Declaration of Independence. He knew by the end that it was the Declaration that had really, that really would be his legacy.
And fascinating also watching the life of a document as the nation grew and all of them looking back on it in retrospect, where there's sort of a Rashomon quality to all of their retellings of it.
Yeah.
That there are some areas where it's fascinating we don't know anything, and other areas where there are multiple conflicting tellings, even by the same person.
Exactly, and I'm really embarrassed, having done 30 years of Asia studies, U.S. and Asia, with a specialty in Japan. I never thought of the Rashomon explanation for this. Would have been perfect in the book, second edition. Yes, so when you get to the arguments that happen later in life, everyone's retired, they now have time to argue, they are all remembering things slightly differently. And one of the big ones is that Jefferson, this is one where they agree upon, actually, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and a few others, Benjamin Rush and others, all write later that we adopted and wrote out and signed the document on July 4th, the one that you see in the National Archives. And clearly that's not the case. It didn't happen until much later in the summer, until August, and then it took months to get the signatures on. But they all misremember things that had happened. And then, of course, in I guess today we would call it a sort of wonderful way, probably wasn't wonderful back then for them, but Adams and Jefferson get into a real indirect tussle. They don't directly communicate, but they're each communicating with partisans on their side over who really is responsible for the Declaration. And Adams, in his somewhat acerbic way, dismisses Jefferson, says there's nothing in this that's new, that hadn't been hackneyed about. But Jefferson responds in a letter to James Madison saying he's right. And again, that goes back to that original, it wasn't meant to be new. But what I find interesting about that is this is happening in the 1820s. So the Federalist era is over. Jefferson's presidency is over. The Federalist Party is gone. I mean, we're in a new generation. We're past 1812, the war and the Second American Revolution. And it's after that war that the Declaration really reemerges. It had largely been forgotten for 50 years. And it now takes on a new and somewhat totemic importance, both because the physical document survives the burning of Washington just by the skin of its teeth. Less than 24 hours, it escapes Washington being burned. And as that story gets out, it just attracts attention, by the way, to a document that most Americans didn't know existed. They'd never seen the engrossed parchment, the one that everyone signed. That was a state paper kept rolled up in the State Department library. They didn't even know it existed until they found out that it had survived. And then they said, what survived? Oh, there's this document. So it becomes an object of interest. And then secondly, it's the idea that America, for the second time in a generation or so, had defeated the greatest power on earth and really was a going concern. It was viable country now, right? And so that gives to the founding document a new life. And so when Jefferson and Adams are arguing over it in the 1820s, it might be an argument from 1776, but the resonance is because this is becoming the national treasure in the minds of Americans.
It's fascinating. During that same 50 years, as you write about, while it's maybe forgotten in America, it's already having a massive influence in other places. There's this amazing point in the book where you list out all the former colonies across the Americas that have their own declarations that are inspired directly by this.
Yeah, I hope you won't ask me to list them because I can't remember. It's like, what are the amendments? But yes, so the first one, of course, that's influenced is the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789. Again, Jefferson is in Paris. He is communicating with the Marquis de Lafayette, who is essentially in charge of the process of coming up with the Declaration, trying to bridge the king and the nobles and the people. And he actually doesn't like what Lafayette comes up with. There are parts of it that he thinks get away from, quite frankly, the metaphysics, the more defendable concepts of property, of actually happiness, and what shouldn't be in there. Certain things like what is actually inalienable. And he says, no, property is alienable. I mean, I can give property to someone, but I can't give my rights to someone. And so if you put property in, you're muddying the waters. And it's very funny because I think it was Dumas Malone, the great Jefferson biographer, noted his great biography in the 40s that in America, Jefferson's considered a radical. And in Europe, he's considered a conservative. He sort of falls between the stools because he's telling Lafayette, don't go so far. And in fact, when you look at a lot of these other declarations, the ones in Europe and the ones in Latin America, they are declarations of independence. They have a resonance with ours, but a lot of them are more radical. They do follow more the French model than the American model. But there is no question that, especially the early Latin American declarations are looking to America. They are looking, how do you make clear that you are now independent? What very few of them have, again, is the philosophy that our declaration has. It doesn't, they don't have the preamble and they don't have the conclusions. But of course, when Jefferson wrote that, those were not the parts that people paid attention to, right? They paid attention to the charges. These were lawyers and legal thinking, and the charges explain why this is the right thing to do at the time. The preamble only becomes powerful much later on, and particularly with Abraham Lincoln.
In terms of the physical object, I mean, there are multiple physical objects, but the big one that we talk about, there was a kind of a mythologizing almost from the beginning of it, but also a secrecy which I was not aware of, that the document wasn't really made public. That physical document,
yeah.
The printings of it obviously were out until decades later. But could you explain that a little bit, because there's a context of secrecy in revolutionary document keeping that I was not aware of.
Well, I mean, from one perspective, it's treason. And so everything that Congress was doing was secret. In fact, they had to sign secrecy pledges. And you go, if the National Archives, the one in Washington, has just opened a wonderful exhibit. It's called Free and Independent. I highly encourage you to be able to go and see it. They have an original Dunlap printing. Those were the printings done on July 4th in Philadelphia and then spread throughout the colonies. They have a wonderful set of documents and lives of the signers, and then how Americans have thought about the Declaration, for the past 250 years. Just a wonderful collection. One of those is the secrecy document that members of Congress had to sign, which is why there were different journals kept. There was a sort of an open public journal. There was a secret journal. The public journals were published starting in 1777. The secret journals were not published until 1823. And even in the secret journals, what was not kept were the debates themselves. And for a historian, it's heartbreaking. We don't really know what people were arguing at the time. We know what they did because they would write, we did X and Y, and we kept it secret. But we don't know who said what. So for example, probably the biggest one, the actual vote for independence, the only record we have is Thomas Jefferson's private contemporary notes from the time. And we assume he was a faithful note taker, but it's the only thing we have to go on. So we really don't know who said what. Similarly, we have absolutely no documentation over any debates over the Declaration itself, who was in favor, who was opposed, or even more crucially for those who want to go through how the document evolved, the editing. And it was very heavily edited. We know what was taken out because Thomas Jefferson wrote his draft, and then because he was so upset at what Congress did, wrote multiple copies of his draft to send to people. And then one of the most important documents we have, in fact, is here in the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's John Adams's handwritten copy of Jefferson's draft that was done at a very early stage, probably the earliest stage. So when you read John Adams's copy, it is as close as we can get to what Jefferson originally wrote. And all of that was kept secret. As you note, the document was kept secret, and really something I didn't know or certainly didn't think of until I got into doing the book. Until January of 1777, Americans did not know who had signed the document, except for John Hancock. Because what was printed, what are called broadsides, these Dunlap broadsides, had only the names of John Hancock and Charles Thompson, who was the Secretary of Congress. And so when they were picked up by local presses, a lot of them, by the way, printed here in Massachusetts, Salem, Essex, other places were printing them, they would print the same thing. Only in January 1777, after we had won a few crucial victories, Trenton and Princeton, with George Washington, did Congress decide it was time to let Americans in the world know who had signed the document. So Congress then is in Baltimore, and they give it to Mary Catherine Goddard, who is the postmaster of the city. She's also a printer from a very well-known printing family, and she prints out what's known as the Goddard broadside that has all of the names. And this is the first time that Americans and the world knows who actually signed the document. You know, people may have known who was in Congress, but not everyone in Congress signed the document. So that's the first time. As I mentioned, the secret journal isn't released until the 1820s. And so it's piece by piece that Americans are learning about the history of the fundamental document that in many cases they just took for granted. It was just sort of there. And over time, it becomes a more complicated story.
And especially interesting in that first 100, 150 years that afterwards, because what you're talking about is really tracing modern mass media, as we call, like, art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and the printing and engraving. America was just lousy with printers and engravers at that time. Producing, these are actual works of art, like the stone engraving. They're genuine works of art.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of the book to do, was to look at the material culture of the, well, first of the parchment, why it survived. That was really where I wanted to start the book with. I just wanted to do a quick book on why is the parchment still there? Why can I take my son to go see it? But it quickly expanded, and I talk about 3 declarations in the book. The first is the relic that sits in the National Archives and the incredible adventure story of its survival and the incredible story of trying to preserve it, keep it from the hand of time. That's the first one. The second one is where you started, the metaphysics. I didn't call it that, but the symbol, I should have called it that, but the symbol, how it became the great expression of Americanism, of the American ideal, that all groups could now become part of it and appeal to it. That, to me, is the greatness and the capaciousness of the document. And then the third declaration is what you've just talked about. It's this cultural object. And starting in the late 18-teens, you get these artistic reproductions and these facsimiles that begin spreading the document around to Americans. And it is, to me, a perfect marriage of civics and commerce, that the ones who did it explicitly were out to make money, but they also explicitly said, this is your charter of liberty. You should have this on the wall to remind you and your children of where your freedoms come from. And they initially, these were not, what they did is they copied the signatures initially. And everyone got really fascinated with the signatures and then got fascinated with the lives of the signers. But the text itself, that iconic text, they just sort of did artistically. And you mentioned the stone, and that again, another crucial Bostonian and Massachusettsian, John Quincy Adams, when Secretary of State, his father's still alive, commissions a faithful, exact reproduction facsimile, not an artistic one, because less than 50 years after the signing, the document is already decaying and degrading and falling apart. And he knows there's no way to save it, but what you can do is, in essence, take a snapshot of it. And so it's engraved over a period of 3 years, and whenever you go and you see one of those beautiful engravings of the Declaration, or you buy it for your children, the crinkly ones, remember? Well, I got the crinkly ones on the wall. I usually have one in my talks. I pull it out at this point, and I show that. I forgot it back at home, I'm sorry, but the crinkly ones, those all come from the stone. Without the stone, we really would not have a good sense of what the document really looked like. We'd have, sort of a phantom-esque document, because even by the time they hung it up in the patent office in Washington in 1841, it was already fairly well degraded, not as much as today. And so it is circulated as a commoditized part of American culture. But when you see some of these, they are faithful and artistic. John Adams, I have to mention, the second one to come out, but the first one to be conceived of, is called the Binns facsimile, John Binns. And he came up with one that was really complicated and complex, with cartouches of signers and other famous Americans. I'll get to that in a second.
Like a medieval manuscript, kind of.
It was incredibly complex, and he got beaten to market by someone else because he made it so complex. But he finishes his, and he sends it off. This is 1819, and he sends it off to famous Americans. Thomas Jefferson's one, and some others. He sends it to John Adams. John Adams wonderfully returns it to him, saying, "Thank you, but don't worry, I don't need it, and please don't bother sending another." And the reason is because at the top, in the 3 central cartouches, are Washington, who had nothing to do with the Declaration, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Hancock. And so Adams is rightfully a bit peeved that he's not included and sends this thing back, but it also shows the level to which the document was becoming this icon in the minds of Americans. And Adams was rightfully upset that, you can understand why Washington's there, but he's out fighting. He had nothing to do with passing independence the way Adams did. And so these are continuously reproduced throughout the 19th century, and I trace a lot of them. There is one recent book that came out, but nothing else on these. And by the turn of the 20th century, there was something like well over 100, I think 110 or so, different artistic envisionings of the Declaration. And I have some of them in the book, and some pictures of a few of them. One, it's just so fascinating how inventive they were. They varied the script of the Declaration between very thin writing and thick writing, and did it so that it is a picture of George Washington. When you look at it, it's like a pointillist, right? You look at it and it's George Washington from afar, and if you get really close, it's the Declaration. So this was very, very much part of our artistic heritage and our civics heritage, going through the 19th century and into the 20th century, when finally the stone becomes the sort of iconic, accepted reproduction.
You write about how there are so many gaps in what we don't know about the drafting of the Declaration, but also this one that we have a rough draft, which is, it's like having a rough draft of the Nicene Creed, or like having a rough draft of the Nicene Creed, which condemns slavery. Can you talk about that and how the afterlife of the rough draft?
Yes. So the rough draft, Jefferson gets the pen. He writes this up in probably about 10 days. I was just looking at his journal books. He doesn't keep a diary, but he keeps a journal book, tells what he does every day. He's buying socks and knives and going out and dining, and then there's this silent period, right when we know he gets the commission, and then he picks up again. So I think we've pretty well identified the period in which he's writing this. And he gives it to the Committee of 5. Ben Franklin has the gout, so he's not really involved, but he then sends him a separate copy and says, "Tell me what you think." The committee does stuff to it. We don't really know what happens, but again, because nobody's keeping notes, but later in life, Jefferson, he's tracking the changes on his rough draft. And later in life, he annotates it, and he says, this was Dr. Franklin. So for example, in the first line, he originally writes, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to so on and so forth. Franklin, he indicates, changes that to one people, which I think is a critical change. That to me is the beginning of the document becoming our great statement of unity. It's the unity document. But he goes through others. He says, Adams, Franklin, Adams. He doesn't really mention. The other two members of the committee don't seem to be very well involved. Then, around June 28th, he writes out what he calls the fair copy. That means just a clean copy. And he brings that to Congress. That's what Congress debates. As far as we know, they didn't make any other copies. There's been some arguments as to that, but we've never found evidence. So there's one copy, clean copy, that Congress debates. Then they vote independence, July 2nd, July 3rd, and 4th, they edit it, and they edit it a lot. Now, shockingly, as most commentators have noted, this was one of the few times that a massive committee did a good editing job, that they actually made it better. What we read today is better than what Jefferson wrote, but it also is very different, and you referenced it. To him, he called these mutilations and depredations against the document, but the one that really got his goat was the taking out of the condemnation of the slave trade. And it was the longest paragraph. It was a passionate paragraph that condemned the slave trade, and that was the first compromise. It was the first deal with the devil to get the new nation started. And it was both Southern interests and Northern interests that really, it was sort of the middle states that, were happy with it. But the Northern mercantile interests were less happy, and of course the Southern slaveholding interests. Now, this isn't the plantation economy yet. That's later. That's 19th century. We think of, you think of the full sort of Terra-style plantation. This is Tidewater, Virginia. This is tobacco. It's rice. It's indigo. It's a little bit of cotton, but it is still a mainstay of the Southern economy. So for Jefferson, this taking out, and he ruminates on this, even as he is, of course, a slaveholder, he is ruminating on this the rest of his life, talking about the fact that they cannot square this circle, and this is the sleeping serpent that he fears for the future of the country, and that this was, in many ways, in terms of what the document was, it was his great regret. And then, of course, there's the infamous compromise with the Constitution that allows the slave trade to be prohibited after 1808, should Congress decide to do that, which it does. But this is the first compromise. So he keeps this rough draft, and as I said, he's very upset with what Congress did, so he writes out about 5 to 6 other copies, spreads them around. But if you're in Washington this summer, his rough draft with his edits will be going on display at the Library of Congress, starting in July, maybe June, July. First time, as far as I know, it's been seen in 50 years. And it was the one thing, by the way, I had a wonderful fellowship at the library to do the book, finish the book. They showed me everything I wanted except that. That's the number one of all things. They just said, that one, we're getting ready. So you will have a very rare chance to go down to Washington and see Jefferson's handwritten, hand-edited rough draft. And it is interesting. I mean, if you really get into it, tracing the way that some of the charges were condensed and softened, there's an ad hominem attack on the British people that's also taken out. It is a better document, but in some ways it lacks the passion.
Not as mean to the king.
No, the king still comes off pretty badly in the document, I would say. And it's interesting because John Adams himself says he never thought of George as a tyrant. He said he thought that the term was too much. And again, it's Jefferson's, he's emotional, and it is expressed emotionally. And these two committees, the 5 and then the Congress as a whole, really do him credit. Again, and by the end of his life, he wants it on his tombstone. I think he recognizes that the editing was the right thing to do.
It's interesting you talk about that one crucial edit, turning this from into a unity document, as opposed to a separation that we're all separate from England. And how, again, the course of the evolution of the ideas and people approaching this, going through to the Civil War, where it's easy to understand to see how Abraham Lincoln would turn to the Declaration for inspiration about keeping the Union together, but the Confederate leaders turned to it for inspiration because of that separation part, because you need the consent of the governed.
Yeah, it's which I again wasn't aware of, and I find it part of the power of the document that it could appeal in so many different ways. To back up for just a second, normally, I don't want to say normally, usually the way that the document is interpreted or parsed, by scholars is there are two competing claims. One is the equality claim, all men are created equal, and then there's the liberty claim, partly consent of the governed and partly we have a right to do all these things as an independent nation. I think for Jefferson and the signers, they were both sides of the same coin, and they would have said, you can't have liberty if some are unequal, then it's not really liberty. For them, they didn't really see a contradiction, but they've sort of gone through periods, the equality and liberty claims. And I think especially Lincoln casts it he's casting it in both, but the rhetoric he uses is really about the equality claim. And he's saying, we're not Americans, we're not America if we're not living up to the equality claim. But I think particularly for us, since the civil rights movement, we've thought of it in terms of the equality argument probably a little bit more than the liberty argument. But you're right, at other points in time, this liberty argument was really, and I think for the first 50 years, it was probably more of a liberty argument when if people referenced it, they would just say, well, this is what made us free. It's a liberty argument. When the crisis comes, the Confederate leaders do pull up the consent of the governed claim. And they are not wrong to do so in the sense of what had been the understanding of the document. And in fact, Northern newspapers, and I quote at least one of them in the book, also agree with this. And they say, well, the South is right. If it's not consent of the governed, which is one of the core, maybe the core claim in the Declaration, what else can it be? So they have a right to leave, but they must do it peacefully, right? So there's the nub, is it's not a peaceful separation, and so Lincoln is obviously able to deny those claims. And by the end of the war, and it is a tragedy from that perspective. Their understanding of the document had been refuted, and they would have, in the South, would have to come to a new understanding of the document because the one that they had based their rebellion on and their understanding of their rights as Americans had been denied in bloody conflict. For Lincoln, of course, he is championing the idea of unity, right? It's union. You go back to Daniel Webster's famous liberty and union, now and forever, one and indivisible, to paraphrase. But it's really Lincoln who brings this into the mainstream as a political philosophy and a political movement. And forever since is how we have understood what he makes them and calls them eternal and universal claims of the document. Now, he's building on abolitionists, black and white. He's building on David Walker. He's building on Frederick Douglass. He's building on others. But he is the one who actually makes it the political philosophy. And he's doing this in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which basically said, well, if the people vote for slavery, then slavery's okay. That's Stephen Douglas. I'm from Illinois, so we've got two Illinoisans fighting it out. And Stephen Douglas is saying, well, that's fine. Then that's consent of the governed. If they want slavery, they can have it. And of course, the Dred Scott case in the Supreme Court, which for the first time essentially said, Black Americans have no rights, are not Americans. So, and Lincoln says these are mutilations of our Declaration and the Constitution. But for him, it's the spirit, what he calls the apple of gold, that is the Declaration, that animates everything. And it's starting in the 1830s, but really energized with those two decisions in the 1850s. And as he says in Philadelphia, on the way to Washington for his inauguration, he stops at Independence Hall. He's talking about the Declaration. He says, I've never had a thought that didn't emanate from the Declaration, he says, and I would rather be assassinated than give up those principles. And then he was.
It's interesting how during the Civil War, and you tell this part of the story as well, that the debate over who owns the Declaration of Independence is literal as well as a figurative debate, where there's concern about the Confederates stealing it, right?
Yeah, well, Washington's a front row city, a front line city. Right, across the river is Virginia, and as soon as Virginia goes over, it doesn't go over with the first 6 to secede, but as soon as Virginia goes over, Washington becomes a frontline city, and it is paralyzed with fear that it will be invaded. And the newspapers, many of which I quote, over and over are repeating Confederate news stories and repeating stories about spies. It's a sympathizer city. It is a southern city, and it's in between 2 southern states, one in the Union, basically forced to stay in the Union, Maryland, and Virginia. It is filled with sympathizers. It's filled with spies. And the Declaration's just hanging up in the old patent office, as the part of what was basically what's the Smithsonian today. It's the National Museum, and it would have been either just like in 1814, it would have been great war booty, or it would have been destroyed, and it would have been a great blow. And for Lincoln, again, the fight to save the Union is a fight to preserve the principles of the Declaration and the rule of law of the Constitution. And again, he sees them seamlessly together. But this argument over ownership is actually one that goes up into the 1950s, and I loved that part of it too. I think it gives a very human scale to the Declaration. We think of it as this static document, and it's had this fascinating life, and people didn't want to give it up. So in 1876, it goes to Philadelphia for the centennial. And I have a whole chapter on that, and to me, it was a very fun chapter. So the Centennial Exposition, millions of people, 9 million go to the exposition, and millions go see, they don't have turnstiles, but millions go see the Declaration. It closes down, and the Philadelphians don't want to give the Declaration up. It was sent up specifically for this, and they start passing these resolutions. I'm going to go speak in Philadelphia in a couple weeks. I'm sort of nervous about how to talk about this, because they tried it in 1976 too, by the way. 1876, they passed these resolutions saying, keep it here. It's going to be in the Independence Hall. Everyone will see it. Meanwhile, in Washington, it's like 3-dimensional chess. In Washington, the Interior Department, which has been having custody of it for decades, is fighting State Department, which is the official custodian who wants it back. Has to go all the way up to the president. The president's Ulysses S. Grant. So he's having none of this. And he just says, give it to State. And immediately, Philadelphia, very nervous, sends it right back. Interior sends it to State with this very groveling note, like it's not our fault, blame the Philadelphians. And State Department has it. Then when the Library of Congress has it, and the National Archives wants it, starting in the 1930s, because they built the archives building, the library won't give it up. So it's who owns the Declaration, right? We do, but who owns it? And even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, probably the most powerful president of the 20th century, would not cross the Librarian of Congress, Herbert Putnam, who was this force of nature to try to get the Declaration where it belongs. And it takes until after World War II to actually get it into the archives. And there's still a bit of raw feelings there.
Love that. Are we on time? Great. We're going to have questions from the audience. I'm going to be disciplined and give up some of the time here.
Please.
But you're talking about the 1876, the centennial celebration. And that was also a time, I know this from the book, where the suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, that was when they were coming around to, hey, can we have the Declaration live up to its billing?
And writing their own. I mean, that actually starts in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. But in 1876, when the actual original Declaration, as I mentioned, is brought up to Philadelphia, it's read in front of a massive crowd. And at the end of that ceremony, Susan B. Anthony gets up with a few Confederates, and they walk among the crowd, passing out their own Declaration of Independence of the Rights of Women. And this is that moment. And now it obviously doesn't come to fruition for decades more, not until the 19th Amendment, and it's long after the lifetimes of most of them. But that, I think, again, is what marks to me the greatness of the document as well as its unifying aspect. When Frederick Douglass is referencing the document in 1852, what to the slave is the 4th of July, Or David Walker is doing it as well and saying, you are not living up to the Declaration. Or Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They are making a claim to be full Americans, for unity, to be unified with the rest of the country, to have their rightful place as Americans and with those full sets of rights. It's not separatism. That is what I think the power of the Declaration is that through our history, its 18th century silences were filled because of the greatness of the document, that all could see in it their path to becoming full Americans. Another chapter, and one of my favorite chapters, because it relates to my own family history, is the great wave of immigration that came in the 1880s to 1920s. Now, of course, after that, we cut off immigration for a period 1924 on until 1965. But in that period, the immigrant communities and what you might want to call the Mayflower communities, both are thinking, how do we turn these millions of newcomers who don't speak English, who aren't coming from liberal nations, meaning nations with a liberal political system or democratic system, how do we turn them into Americans? And the immigrants themselves are saying that. And one of the key things they use is the Declaration. So I go through the translations that are done by immigrant communities. It's not forced on them. They want this to be the expression within their own communities of becoming American. And then it's paired with civics handbooks and citizen handbooks and the like. But at the center of it is the Declaration in the way that it was for someone like David Walker, who says, again, your fathers are not living up to what they had proclaimed. You must do that now. And what Susan B. Anthony is claiming, and now what immigrants are becoming part of. And so that's why with this liberty claim and this equality claim I talked about, I see over it, as I've gone through the book, I see over it an umbrella, and that's an umbrella of unity. And it's a message that I think is still there, and I think it's one that we should try to recover and recapture.
Brilliant. We'll go to the audience now for a question. I have a comment on that. That was one of the things that I actually found deeply moving about the book personally, the Declaration is really important to immigrants. And you write about the bicentennial in 1976. I'll just share a quick story. I was 6 years old, and we held a big party at my house. We lived outside of Washington, D.C., because my father had just become a citizen just a few years earlier. And yeah.
I'm with you. I was 9. I'm with you. It made you think about history. It got you excited about history, plus tall ships and fireworks and all that stuff. But it made you feel there was something of true value, and why families, your family newer, my family had been in for a generation or so. But I remember them talking about the first time they would see certain things, the first time they saw a declaration, or the first time they went to Mount Vernon, or if they had done these trips. And of course, the idea that the parents who had come sent their sons off to fight in World War II. My father was too young, but all of his brothers went, and his brothers-in-law all went. So I grew up on those stories, and thank God all of them came back. But I grew up on those stories, and it was expressed that their parents still spoke with the accent, but they had sent their sons off to fight for freedom and liberty as full Americans. And that was a source of enormous pride, as I'm sure it was for your family, being part of the bicentennial, right when your father had become an American citizen. I loved that chapter. I really did.
Question? Yeah, would you mind stepping up to the microphone? Thank you.
You mentioned metaphysics. You didn't mention that it was Christian metaphysics. The second thing I would like to mention, if you look at the names of the people who signed the document, a lot of them are, a majority are Christian saints. And the other thing, did you ever consider the people who didn't sign, the names that aren't there? And it's amazing when you look at the names that aren't there, it's very informative also. So Christian metaphysics, and then the cultures that are not in the document.
I do talk about that in the book, so I am glad you brought it up. I mean, for the signers, their worldview was inseparable from the Bible. The most references to rights, freedom, liberty, and the like during the Revolutionary period and the later colonial period are in pulpit sermons. But that's how most people were exposed to these ideas. The pulpit preachers would be out there talking about what we today would call natural rights, rights from God. And these were Judeo-Christian values that were interpreted through a broadly Protestant frame and then inserted into the larger political community. Jefferson, he wasn't an atheist. He was a deist. He wrote his own Bible, right? He took out all the stuff he thought was wrong with the New Testament and left what he thought was the core. I mean, he was as informed. Now, Congress puts in a few more references to God, which makes sense given how, as the divine power, as the divine judge, the supreme being, nature's God, which is, this concept that's an Enlightenment concept. It's a rational God. It may not, in the view of what they were writing in the document, have been, the Old Testament wrathful God, but it is a rational God who orders the universe, which is why Jefferson uses concepts, self-evidence and propositions and the like. They thought within this framework. But there's no question that the Judeo-Christian values that were central to the worldview of colonial Americans instilled this document, along with English common law and along with the Enlightenment conceptions through John Locke of what rights are. And so there's one Catholic signer, which is Charles Carroll of Carrollton in Maryland, and one Quaker signer, I'm right, in German, I think. Now I'm just blanking, but I'll go back. I have to keep a copy of the book with me. It's 250 years, so can't remember everything, unfortunately, every day. But
And are there names that are not on the document that are surprising, conspicuous in their absence?
the most important is when you know the story, it's not surprising. But the most conspicuous is of course John Dickinson, the famous Pennsylvania farmer philosopher, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, who does not sign it. Also, Robert Morris does not sign it, and in fact, Robert Livingston, who's on the committee that drafts it, does not sign it. And everybody has their own reasons. By the time that the document is signed, by the way, which is not July 4th, it's later in the summer, Livingston's back home doing New York politics. But Dickinson felt it wasn't time. The time was not right. And that was really the debate on July 2nd. And the final battle that I mentioned, the marathon 9-hour debate over independence on July 2nd, was between John Adams and John Dickinson on either side. But what does Dickinson do? He does two things that I think are heroic and are a model for all Americans. First, he, along with Robert Morris, decides to absent themselves, to abstain on July 4th. The votes were done by colony. They weren't done by person, right? So that within the colonial delegation, let's say there were 4 people, they'd vote, or 3 people or 5, probably better to have an odd number, right? So they'd vote, and the majority would then carry, and the colony would vote as one. That's why they needed to get unanimity. So Pennsylvania split. Ben Franklin and a few others are on one side, and Dickinson and Morris are on the other side. And they decide, after the marathon debates on July 4th, on July 2nd, so the debate on July 1st, they're going to absent themselves from the July 2nd vote so that Pennsylvania can vote in the affirmative and vote with the colonies for unanimity's sake. South Carolina does the same thing. So number one, I think it's a wonderful lesson of compromise. It's political compromise. It's not what he believed in. He thought it was wrong at the moment, but he also understood that a non-unanimous vote, or potentially a failed vote, even though he thought it wasn't the right time, could be fatal to the movement, certainly a non-unanimous vote. They needed unanimity. So he put aside his own personal feelings. That was number one. Number two, what did he do right after that? He went and he enlisted in the army. So even though he said this isn't the time, I mean, you're in the war, but he said it's not the time for independence, he goes and he fights. So I think he's the most conspicuous name. that's not on it. All told, there were something like 80 plus delegates to the Continental Congress. They weren't all there for the whole time. They came in, they came out. Some were there for long periods, like John Adams. He was there almost the whole time. Others, like Thomas Jefferson, were going and coming and then staying near the end point. So we don't know everyone who might have signed, or those who had been there and then just, they happened not to be there, so they didn't. What we do know, though, are those who were involved in this process, like most notably Dickinson or a few others who didn't sign.
Hi, I am here as a representative for your online audience. And we had the question, if Thomas Jefferson was not selected as the author, who was the backup? Who would have been chosen instead?
It's a wonderful question. He was also really young, so it was a little easier to foist it on the young guy and just say, do your duty for, would have been king and country up to then, but after that it's no longer king and country. So we don't know. I mean, John Adams could have written it, but there's this wonderful, again, recollection that there's a couple of different versions. I pick one and I put it in the book where Jefferson said, I don't want to do it. And why are you asking me to do it? And Adams says 3 reasons. He says, first, you're a Virginian, and a Virginian should be at the head of this business. Second, I'm hated, so it's not going to be really good if I do it. And third, you can write 10 times better than I can. Ben Franklin said he would never write anything that a committee would get its hands on, so he was out. Roger Sherman was actually heading up the committee, or on the committee, to come up with Articles of Confederation, so he was busy. Livingston also, by the way, was against independence at this point. He just felt it also was too early, and he was probably put on the committee as sort of a minority view. So it either would have been Adams or Jefferson, and you can imagine Adams writing it. It would have been philosophically, in terms of legal arguments in history, the most extraordinarily tight, compact writing ever, but it may not have had the passion that a Thomas Jefferson could bring to it. And so we're pretty lucky that the young guy just sort of felt he had no choice. And by the way, he was on 4 other committees at the same time. Again, we sort of think, and we have these wonderful pictures. One of them, I'm pretty sure, is in the book, where he's standing at a table in the candlelight. It's heroic, and it's obviously a 20th century picture. It's this this rewriting of history, and we have others where he and Adams and Franklin are at a table and they're all working over the Declaration. I mean, he's scribbling it out pretty quickly. He's trying to get it done. He's on 4 other committees. They're busy men doing a lot of different things, and so our mythology, which I love the mythology. Mythology is important, and it gives us stories and it gives us shared ideas, but we also have to understand what the reality was, and the reality is this was an administrative task.
Do we have time for one more?
I was just a little curious about you and the Declaration references God a few times, right, or a higher being. And then I believe Jefferson is the one that wrote the letter clearly wanting a wall of church and state. And then I believe in the Constitution it was not mentioned at all. So did he start off like God is in the Declaration as inspiration, and then when it came to perspiration, you just gotta, do you know what I mean? Where did that shift, or where did he say, okay, we gotta stop?
Well, I think
Or separate?
yeah.
Thank you.
Well, he writes one of the other 2 things he puts on his tombstone, along with founding the University of Virginia, is author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. And so for Jefferson, though he really had little truck with organized religion, he understood that an impingement on one's freedom to worship God as they felt was antithetical to what liberty actually meant. And in his letters, he writes this. He says it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or what he, at the time in terms of the word, a Mohammedan, Muslim, a Christian, and don't forget, within Christianity, with all the sects, Catholics are very much discriminated against at the time as well. He said it doesn't matter. Everyone should have the right to worship their own God. Now, in the Declaration, The Declaration's not meant as a governing document. It couldn't be. And, again, this was a statement. It was an announcement. It was a press release, really. But it also had to very carefully balance these different sets of interests. The real tug of war will come with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and of course, Constitution, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of religion. But for Jefferson, it's only natural to reference God as he understood this very rational God that organizes a universe that has principles, that has laws, these metaphysical approaches. It's
The nature's
Congress
God
that puts in-
is also, that's a distinct thing from the Christian
Yeah, the
God,
nature's
right?
God, right, the Enlightenment.
Natural law, that whole...
Exactly, and so it's Congress that puts in the divine providence and supreme judge, which, if those weren't in the document, it would actually, it would have sounded off to us probably in 18th century ear. The Declaration, to me, I hope this isn't controversial, I don't think it is a covenant. Dan Elazar, a wonderful scholar, wrote a lot about this back in the 80s, 90s, but it's a covenant. It's a covenant among Americans. Right? That's why the founders, again, with this unity idea, the founders pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. They didn't pledge that to the new country, and they didn't pledge it to their states. They pledged it to each other. So that to me is part of this covenant. It was a covenant among Americans that they were launching off into this brave new world. They thought they were conserving their traditional liberties, but it was a brave new world to do so. And secondly, in what was utterly understandable and expected at the time, it was a covenant between them and God, and that's why God is in the document. And had he not been in, and Congress was, again, we don't know who debated, and we don't know who made those edits. We don't know who said put in divine judge, but without it, it probably would have sounded a little bit off. And again, mostly because these arguments had been made from the pulpit, above all, for decades by this point.
Michael, Misha, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for this work. It's brilliant. Congratulations on it. Thank you to our audience here and the library and museum. Thank you.
Thank you.